It's kind of interesting that the legislative body, the House of Representatives, that's supposed to be closer to the people every 2 years, would be the one where raising taxes begins. Might have something to do with that whole taxation without representation thing of being closest to the people to begin the process of raising tax revenue. So here we just talked about the three branches of government, what they do. We haven't gotten to the lawmaking process yet, but we talked about what they do, what their roles are, the different things that are unique to the different parts of our government after laying the groundwork for we the people and individual rights, what the Constitution is, and why we even have a Constitution. So far on what I've gone over, do you have any questions? Yes, sir.
This may be a stupid question.
No such thing as a stupid question.
Why wouldn't the judicial branch also have a say in taxes? It seems like taxes need to be distributed fairly, and that to me is seems to be a legal point.
So, here's what's interesting. The Supreme Court, the courts used to be involved in that sort of activity before the 16th Amendment. And the 16th Amendment is what put into effect very broad notion of the income tax. And that enabled not only a flat tax if they wanted to do that, but a progressive income tax based on levels. So outside of income tax, like a wealth tax, I'll say to you guys that I think the idea of a wealth tax that some candidates for president have proposed doesn't fit in with the constitutional, what the Constitution allows as far as taxation under the Constitution as it is today. It doesn't fit under the income tax, and it doesn't fit under the other taxation requirements that are laid forward in the original text of the Constitution. But that's why you can have an income tax that is progressive income taxes because of the 16th Amendment. Any other questions about that? Or about analogies or ways that I might express these things?
I was just going to say, if that question were to come up, you can always say the judicial branch does get involved when someone challenges the constitutionality of it. So they don't bring the judicial branch in at the beginning,
Yes.
but only after it's been passed.
So that's a great point, especially because it's what I'm going to get to next when we get to how a bill becomes a law. So thank you for mentioning that. Great observation. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
In your paperwork, when we're talking about the executive branch duties,
Did I miss something?
there's also
Oh, yes.
mention
duties.
of Commander-in-Chief.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you?
Good catch. That was an omission on my part, accidental. The other thing going in with executing laws and so forth, the president is also the commander-in-chief, meaning that he is in charge of the different branches of our military, which now, of course, includes the Space Force. So he's responsible for keeping America safe, especially in the case of emergency. And if we are at war, he's the one who can give direction to the generals. Congress isn't involved in that. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, what I was going to go to after that is
Yes.
what I recall of studying this in school is that one of the other things that our fresh young country was worried about is who is going to be responsible for talking to other countries.
Mm-hmm.
And so the diplomatic roles as well seemed to need a place, and that's where they put them.
That's a great point. And that falls under Commander-in-Chief in a lot of ways too, because you're trying to make peace, not war, in that regard too. I usually don't bring that up just because I'm tighter on time, and there are some other things that I focused on, but I think that's a very good point. And I would encourage, if you think you can fit all that in amidst everything else, I would strongly encourage that. It's a great point. Thank you. Anything else? Any other great points?
I'm curious how you would explain the Department of Justice appears to be under the executive instead of the judicial.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So the idea of the judiciary is that the other thing, in addition to interpreting the law that we should have mentioned, is that if you're if you're accused of a crime, the judicial process is what works out whether or not you're guilty. So whether you're guilty or not guilty, and what that consequence is going to be. And that should have been discussed during the interpreting part. So if you have the judiciary going through the process of determining if you are guilty or not guilty, and then sentencing you, that same group shouldn't be responsible for bringing the cases and saying, you know what, Judge, we work together, and I think that you should make this guy guilty and lock him up in jail. And then the judge says, yeah, well, we're in the same branch, so of course I'm going to do what you're suggesting. I'm going to go lock this guy up, and not only that, I'm going to throw away the key. You don't want that. So the thing about the Department of Justice is they do the investigations, and then they also present the facts and the evidence, and then the judiciary will work through the process as a separate branch and decide, okay, this person is guilty and should face a consequence, or this person is not guilty and therefore shouldn't face a consequence because they're not guilty for this accused crime. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and since the executive's in charge of enforcing the laws,
Yep.
they're the ones that say, hey, we think this guy's guilty, and this is why.
Yeah, because they're the ones who are going to be, remember I said the FBI, they're conducting the investigation, they're enforcing the laws, making sure people are following those laws. And so that's where your point steps in for sure. Okay, let's get through the lawmaking process. And this is important because there's a lot of different pieces that I bring in, make reference, even though we don't talk about the Bill of Rights in this particular presentation because we're focusing on foundations. And if we did Bill of Rights, I have a whole other presentation for that. If you do, for some reason, it would be great, get called back and they say, hey, I'd love you to come back in a couple days or something. I have a separate presentation and volunteer packet that's specifically on individual rights and goes through some of the cornerstones of the Bill of Rights and some of the other rights that are guaranteed under the U.S. Constitution in the later amendments. So how a bill becomes a law. The first process we said is, first step in the process, we already said that the legislative branch makes the laws. Now, what does that mean to make the laws again? Remind me what it means to make the laws.
They write up basically write it up.
Right, it being what?
The law, whatever the law would cover.
Right.
What the law they want.
Yeah, the rules for the country, whatever that's going to be. And what the first step in that process is then to become a law is you have to put forward a bill.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would describe a bill as a proposed law, an idea for a law. Now, as we talked about before, if it has to do with raising taxes, then it has to begin in the House of Representatives. If it's going to adjust what's going on with taxes, it has to begin in the House, and then it can go on to the Senate. But otherwise, it's fair game for what they get to decide as far as laws of the country. I'm not talking about treaties or appointments, but just everyday laws that Congress is trying to put into effect. So the House and the Senate, they can come up with a bill, but then they have to agree with whatever that bill is. Both the House and the Senate, not a comma or a period can be different. That's one of the things I like to stress. Everything's got to be exactly the same between the two bills when they are agreed upon. Both the House and the Senate vote on it. Then what happens if they agree to move it on to the next step in the chain? Where does it go after they both pass the bill? President. And the president has two options at that moment. There are a couple additional options. We're going to focus on the main two here. What are those two options? What's the first one that he could do? Sign it. And then what happens?
It becomes law.
He can sign the bill and it becomes a law. But if he doesn't agree with it, doesn't like it, what can he do?
Veto.
He can veto it. What does a veto mean? What does it mean
He
veto?
doesn't sign it.
To reject it.
Reject it.
To reject it. To say, nope, I don't want this. Then what can happen? Is it dead then?
No.
Does it go to the Supreme Court to overrule?
No.
No. What could happen?
It could go back to that
Back to
legislation.
And then how can Congress override the president's veto, overrule him, say, no, we want this to be a law anyway.
Two-thirds majority.
Two-thirds vote of
The House.
both, exactly. Both the House and the Senate, it has to be a two-thirds vote. Now, why do you think a two-thirds vote? I don't bring this up necessarily, but just, it might be a question. Why a two-thirds vote and not a majority vote when we're talking about a veto?
So it doesn't hang on one or two people?
Yeah. Because it shouldn't be that if the president is supposed to decide if a bill becomes a law, that Congress can just easily override it by the same number of people that it can have in the original process to get it to the president.
Well, it had already passed with a majority,
Yes, exactly.
and therefore it needs a supermajority to
Precisely. Supermajority is the term for two-thirds, exactly right. Yes, sir. That's a good question. I'll go ask my buddy James Madison about that one. No, I think it makes sense to me that it would be two-thirds, that it's just not all the way up to three-fourths. I mean,
They were a very contentious group. I think
Yeah.
they were pretty sure they'd never get 3/4.
yeah, actually, that's a good point. That's a good point.
So it isn't just something new?
This is a way to actually do it, to make it happen. And, but it's not a really, really high bar to meet. I mean, it's a good point. That's what I would say.
Well, we have to remember that these guys were all ultimately being treasonous to.
Yes, it's true.
So-
Well, actually, in a sense they were, because the Articles of Confederation was the law at the time. And they were saying, we're just going to go ahead and, forget that Articles and create our own requirements for this new Constitution to happen. So in essence, they were committing treason against the Articles of Confederation, which was America's first Constitution. By the way, you'll notice in the packets I have beginning of the lesson or preparatory portion. That's not something I necessarily go over. That's more background for you all as speakers to have an understanding a little bit more of the Articles of Confederation and what led us up to the Constitution in 1787 and then 1789 when it became ratified. So, back to the process of a bill becoming a law. First, Congress puts forward a bill, either the House or the Senate, a proposed law. It passes. Then it goes to the president. The president has two choices. He can sign it or he can veto it. If he vetoes the bill, then it goes to the Congress again, and it can be overridden by a two-thirds vote. And then if Congress, by a two-thirds of the House and two-thirds of the Senate, decides, yes, this is going to become law anyway, what happens then? Does it automatically become law? Or does it have to go through some other step?
It has to be
It's law.
action.
It's law. It does. The Supreme Court, to the point before, has absolutely no role in the law-making process whatsoever. Some people might say, ask the question, well, okay, after overriding the veto, does it just become law then? Or does the Supreme Court get to say yes? Or if Congress turns it down, does it go to the Supreme Court and they can make it law anyway? Or the president, if he vetoes it, does it go to the Supreme Court? Some answer might say, well, it's not two-thirds Congress. They might not say that first. They might say, well, it goes to the Supreme Court, right? They can make a decision. It doesn't. The Supreme Court has no role in the lawmaking process whatsoever. Where it comes into the role is afterwards. If somebody thinks that a law is unconstitutional and they bring a case to the courts and it works its way up, and the Supreme Court says, you know what, you're right. This is unconstitutional, then they can get rid of it. Lock, stock, and barrel. They can do it all together, get rid of that law. It's no longer on the books, or sometimes they can get in there and say, this part isn't law, but the rest of this is law. But this is when I like to just go through real quick a scenario for how, after a bill becomes a law, for how it can go up into the Supreme Court. And so what I will do is I will say, Congress is considering a new bill. And I'll go through the whole process and get to that phase of the Supreme Court. Congress is considering a brand new bill to make a national movie. Let me ask you kids what your favorite movie is. And I'll get a whole bunch of different examples. A lot of times, I'm old enough where there are movies where I'm like, what? Huh? Okay, all right, no. And I will always say, so Congress, I will pick something that maybe somebody didn't like, or usually I'll just say Star Wars. I'll just say Star Wars, because I love Star Wars. So Congress passed this bill saying that Star Wars is the national movie. But the President of the United States, President Trump, isn't a big fan of Star Wars. He prefers whatever's the popular one in the room. Unless the popular one happens to be Star Wars, which is like never the case. So let's say Frozen. President Trump loves Frozen. That's his favorite movie. So he vetoes the bill to make Star Wars the national movie. I am just seething out of the public, thinking, what the heck? We need Star Wars to be the national movie. Thankfully, Congress really wants Star Wars to be the national movie for America, so they override the veto. Voila! Star Wars is the national movie. And some kids sometimes will applaud if they like Star Wars, they're excited. Some will be like, no. They will react. Let me tell you, they will react in this regard. And I will find, so let me ask the crowd, how many of you like Star Wars? How many of you are Star Wars fans? Anybody in here who absolutely despises Star Wars or just really doesn't? What's your name? Sir, in the back, what's your name, sir?
Yeah.
Rumpelstiltskin. No, I don't think that's your name. What is your name?
Wait 1 second here.
Yes, George. All right, please stand, George. Because there's a part of this bill that became law that you were unaware of, but if you do not watch Star Wars at least once every movie, every 2 months, I suggested 1 month, but they decided 2 months. Every 2 months, you don't watch all, I think 10 Star Wars movies are out now, it'll be 11 when the next one comes out. You go to jail for 6 months and you owe $10,000. And George, I'm sorry, but you're in jail. 6 months and you owe $10,000 fine. Okay? Good luck getting there. You're in jail right now. Okay, so who thinks that maybe there's something wrong with that? Who wants to be George's lawyer and argue the case as to why that's wrong? Yes, ma'am. What's your name, ma'am?
Sharon.
Sharon. Please stand, Sharon. George, please stand again. Because here's the thing. Here's the thing. She failed to defend you in court originally because you did violate the law, but she managed to bring you up to the Supreme Court for a case.
He didn't me until afterwards.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Ed was his first lawyer. Ed was his first lawyer.
And he likes Star Wars more than I do.
So, Sharon. You're before the Supreme Court now making a case. You don't think that this is constitutional, I assume. Why not?
Well, it's an individual right that is being violated.
Which right? What right?
Well, his right to unreasonable penalties.
Cruel and unusual punishment.
Cruel and unusual punishment is one thing.
My mind went blank.
Even freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech,
yeah.
Freedom of religion, perhaps. He may have a religious objection to our
If that's the case, then there's a problem there. I don't know.
But
Freedom of choice.
Well, then let me ask you exactly, and I also there's this other point that I think. How in the world did the government find out that George, on his DVD player, on his Netflix, on his Disney Plus, on whatever service that he didn't watch?
The improper search.
Basically spying on the people.
Oh, aren't
That, yeah,
they
unreasonable
never
search.
do
No,
that.
not for Star Wars, not for Star Wars. Okay, so unconstitutional because it goes against his right to freedom to choose, his right to speech, to decide what movies he wants to watch. And if he doesn't like Star Wars because he's patently insane, then he doesn't have to watch Star Wars and shouldn't have to. Also, the government shouldn't be intruding on your property and saying, hey, we're going to monitor your DVD player and make sure that you're watching this or your DVR, all these things, without any sort of permission from a court or something like that. Okay. That's pretty compelling. Sharon, you won the case for George. And I want to let you know, yes, please, round of applause. I said a round of applause. So here's what gets to happen now. Because George has been so grievously violated in his individual rights by being told by the government, which he should just want to do anyway. The government's also awarding George $10 million in restitution. Unfortunately for George, but fortunately for Sharon gets half of that. So congratulations, you're both millionaires because George's rights were violated.
And then we woke up.
Congrats again. So that is literally the process that I will go through, and I will find the kid, and it doesn't have to be Star Wars, even though it should. And it doesn't have to be. Yes,
I'll
sir.
make them watch.
I'm sorry?
I'll make them watch now, math movies.
I would rather something social studies. You know, there are a lot of allegories in a lot of the Star Wars movies to American government, to Roman Republic history, and all these things. So there's a lot of educational material in there. But bottom line is, bringing forward some sort of interactive and engaging way. It doesn't have to be the scenario that I laid out. It doesn't have to be done in that way. The first person to come up with that was actually a volunteer years ago when I was a student at Regis University, who they came up with the idea of a sandwich, a national sandwich. And then I just kind of built on that, took it in this other direction and everything. But that's really just one way to provide some sort of engagement. And you notice, what were you doing? You were laughing, you were having fun, you were engaged, we did some applause and all those kinds of things. The more that you can engage these students and make it real and tangible in the best way possible, the better. And so if you're asked a tough question too, and you're trying to figure out the best way, sometimes it can be a controversial question, and we prefer to dodge those questions as opposed to delve into the controversial material. And there could be like legalization of marijuana in Colorado, federal versus state. There could be questions about gun rights and gun control and those kinds of things. And so we try to keep more focus as best we can on the subjects that we're focusing on here, and not risk getting into any personal views on politics, on certain constitutional interpretations, certain laws, those kinds of things, because we're simply teaching the basic foundations of the government. And we want to make sure that these students are getting a good education, a good introduction on those foundational things, because then they can make up their own minds in the future. When a controversial topic comes up, they can think, maybe they'll think in their mind, does this go against individual rights in a way that it shouldn't? Does this violate the rule book for the government? Or is this something that should be perfectly allowable under the Constitution? And let them make up their own mind. The more engagement, Q&A, activity, excitement that you can bring, the better. And that's really the essence of what we're going to be doing and going into the classroom. So before we get into some of the logistical things and working with teachers and all that, any questions or thoughts and everything on the content? And obviously what I present is a little bit different in how I did it from the packets that you have, but the essence of all the things are in there still.
It's nice to see it done in front of us so that we have something to remember.
Oh, yes.
When we prepare to do it.
Mm-hmm. And what I would recommend to that end is that you review the material here sooner than later and come up with, what are the key things that you might want to do? Do you have an idea that was inspired by what I presented that maybe is a little different or very different in how you present it as far as what fits with your personality? As long as the facts that you're presenting and the concepts are from what we've got, if you have some creative ideas, by all means, please do it. Just remember that you will likely only have about an hour or so to be able to distill all these things down, which is why, notwithstanding the fact that we did a little scenario that talked about some individual rights, specifically that are, say, in the Bill of Rights, protected there, we don't delve into a whole presentation on 5 rights of the First Amendment, the 5 rights of the Fifth Amendment, what's going on in the Fourth Amendment, the Eighth Amendment, all those different sorts of things, because we need more time for that. As I said, I do have another packet. If you're able to do a second day, then more power to you. Happy to pass that along. Trying to think if there's anything else from the presentation standpoint. Oh, the one other thing that we'll make sure that you have, and I wanted to bring copies, but I couldn't find them. At the end of the presentation, you could talk to the teacher before and say, I don't have enough time to do this myself, but if you could, I'd appreciate it. We have this review worksheet. It is literally just 6 questions, multiple choice. The questions are, what is the U.S. Constitution? What are the first 3 words of the U.S. Constitution? The first 3 articles of the U.S. Constitution describe the 3 branches of government. What are they? And all the answers are A, B, C, and D. Why does the U.S. Constitution divide the government into 3 branches? The Congress of the United States is divided into 2 sections. What are they? And in a nutshell, how does a bill become a law, which is the longest answers in these. We'll make sure that you get these electronically, but what I would suggest is we need this back so I can report back to the Daniels Fund, which has provided our grant. So we'd appreciate it. You don't have to do it yourself at the end. What you can do is ask the teacher, can you please do this today or tomorrow, and then I'll come back the end of the week or whatever and pick these up. So that way there's a little bit of encouragement.
Jimmy, I can take that and make copies so I can.
Oh, okay,
see that
great.
for right now.
Sounds good.
Unless you have to read from.
No, you're good.
Okay.
Thank you. So, but one of those is the answer sheet, the other is the questions. So, if you are giving it yourself in the classroom, I wouldn't print out one for every student necessarily. You can go ahead and maybe the teacher will have, you can send them an electronic file, they can put it on their board, or they can put it on a projector or what have you. And then they can take out half sheets of paper, split it with a neighbor, another kid in the class, and then just number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the piece of paper, and then fill in their answers. And then the thing is, we want to make this as simple and straightforward for the teacher. Unless they want to use it for their own classroom purposes, I'm not asking them to grade it. I would ask you to grade them after you get them. Just to say, okay, does this match up? It's so easy because it's questions 1 through 6, and you'll see that they're colored in blue and they're labeled correctly and all that. Been bolded on the answer copy. And then what we will do is make sure that all those are collected. In terms of making arrangements with teachers, usually teachers are very open to this possibility. Schools are very open to having volunteers in there. They like to be able to get an hour where maybe they can be grading or doing something else and not having to focus on the classroom at the moment. They also like having guest speakers come into the classroom and give them something different, some other person presenting as opposed to just the teacher that they see for 6 hours or whatever it is every single day of the week. So usually we get a very strong openness. And what I would say also is that there are 2 ways to go about making an arrangement or getting a school to open their door. One is to talk to the secretary